Morning, everyone. So, just going to go through a bit of a situation and an incident we had on site, and the process we've gone through in finding a solution and approach that can be embedded and go forward at Wilpinjong regarding our blasting practices. So, but before we get going, let's have a quick recap. And thanks for Anthony for yesterday, getting us a bit of an intro onto this. But looking at the 4 steps for a risk management process. The first one, as we all know, we identify the risk. Let's go out there and have a look at what is the risk involved. Assessing the risk, the second step. What's the impacts and what's the severity and the likelihood of these risks impacting our people, our business, our operations. Next one is what controls we're going to put in place to mitigate these risks, reduce them, eliminate them. And then finally, I think that's the process where sometimes we all fall over, but it's the reviewing of those controls and see how effective they are going forward. So just a quick intro for Wilpinjong. So Wilpinjong mine located on the western coalfields of New South Wales, probably about 50 to 60 kilometres northeast of the lovely town of Mudgee. Wilpinjong been operating since 2007 and currently have about 57 million tonnes of proven and probable gold reserves. Also, we've been very fortunate to be granted the exploration licence last year towards the east of the operation. That has a potential of extending and adding another 130 million tonnes to the operation, which we are quite excited about. Looking at last year, roughly producing about 12 million tonnes per year. Most of that is done through 2 mining methods. So we've got a truck and shovel operations, and then also our cast and dozer push operations. Employing just over 500 full-time employees and about 200 contractors on a FTE basis. So let's have a look at the incident. So it's a couple of years ago now. So on the 11th of April in 2022, a cast blast was fired in pit 6. Following on from this cast, there was a few pockets of areas where nitrous fumes was generated, which is not unknown and not unexpected. Probably where the unexpected component was that this nitrous fume plume moved very slowly towards the east and actually engulfed some of our sentries that was placed in the exclusion zone area. So if we look at like all of the open cuts, we do a design based on where we're going to place it, and the typical design for this blast was equipment exclusion was 250 meters away from the blast, personnel was 500 meters away from the blast. I'm going to admit the blast locations or the sentry locations was primarily selected to reduce the impact on the operation. The other one was to make sure that we got clear communication, and then the last one was the effective management of the pre-blast activities to get the area cleared and have people minimize that impact on the operations. That was the criteria, and most of us that's how we do it. So pretty safe traditionally, no issues in that space. Now this blast was started loading on towards the back end of March, and it was, and it was blasted. Sorry, I just want to go there. Was loaded from the south towards the north. After numerous delays, weather delays, a decision was made to change some of the product site towards the north, moving away from a lined ANFO product to emulsion product to mitigate the risk that we foreseen with water in the area after all these rain events. The communication around this blast wasn't fully communicated. A decision was made based on, let's make sure the powder factor stays the same. Let's make sure we're not going to introduce more risks to this blast. And then from there, the blast was initiated. Oh, let's. Sorry, can we get that video to play? Sorry, mate. There we go. So typical cast blast. What you'll start noticing after the blast is formed, there's going to be a few pockets of the fumes being generated. So we see one some there and one there. So as this fume generated, you can see the wind direction was moving it towards the east. And if you can remember the previous slide, this is where we place our sentries in the blast area. So we'll just let it roll. You can see that. Very slow moving. Nitrous fumes being heavier than air, also staked to the ground. And over the next minute or so, this plume moved slowly towards the east. In that area, we had about 3 sentries that was placed, and instruction were given to them that to evacuate the area. Unfortunately, it came too late, and this nitrous fume plume moved over the sentry's location. So of course, out of this, what has happened on the day then, these guys were taken to the first aid room, they were checked, we took them into the hospital, they were thoroughly checked by the doctors and blood tests were done. They've all been cleared and returned back to work. So no one was injured in this one, but it gave us a big scare on site because it could have been a lot worse. So, like all of us, we started doing an investigation and started pulling this apart and see where did we had some failings. So basic cause, a couple of things was identified. The first one was there was a failure to identify some of the water inrush on some bedding planes and a fault structure in the area. The second one failing was that the effects of the nitrous fume plume wasn't identified as it moved towards the east. Some contributing factors was also identified. If you look at task and environmental conditions, our training package was actually quite clear to say that sentries are not allowed to move away from their position, but they were given an instruction by the blast controller to evacuate the area, which is contradicting to what they were said or learned. Some of the organizational failures, is probably the big one, was the process to identify the sentry positions. And how do we determine where to place a sentry position? If you remember that previous slide, it was quite clear, and I think it was stock standard for everyone. We had our 500 meter exclusion zone, we put sentries all around the roads, and off you go. And then probably some of the non-contributing, it was just the processes involved in changing products and identifying issues on the blast wasn't documented correctly. So out of the investigation, we identified 9 corrective actions. Now, if you look at those 9 actions, they're all administrational. You go, how does that work? If you think about what it was all about, it is unfortunately the only one. But 8 of them was administrational, where we updated procedures and training and all those things. But I want to focus on the top one. So the top one, we said that we need to develop and implement a risk-based pre-blast assessment to determine the safe location of sentry points. That's quite a big task and quite a big ask to go forward. So coming back to our initial slide with our risk-based approach, we were quite clear that we want to have a risk-based approach to do this work and not just follow a process of what we think is good. So, like the risk-based, we identify, assess, treat, and monitor. So we looked at those 4 areas and say, okay, what can we put in place? So the first one on the identifiers, we need to identify the potential for fume that's been generated. Now, I mean, we all know, sleep time and all those things, but there's a few more factors that goes into it, as we've seen in in the video as well. It's not across the board. It is actually quite specific in areas. So we develop a environmental blast hazard analysis. So we'll go through this in a bit more detail. The next one was, how do we assess it? How do we assess the risk for people at sentries locations? So from there, we implemented the blast dispersion model. The next one is, how do we treat? If we say we've got a potential fume risk, we know where it's going to go to, so we've assessed it. What is the next step? Like any good miner around the table here, we've got a TARP for that. And then the last one where we review and monitor is, how can we make sure that we close this loop? So we've got the blast controller checklist, which is updated to reflect all these changes that we've put in place. So looking at them individually on those, it's quite extensive. The Wilpinjong environmental blast hazard analysis process is quite extensive, and it takes a lot of things into account. It takes things into account like the ground conditions, is it hard, is it broken, moisture levels, is it damp, or is it wet, fume history, previous strips, if there was a fume generation, we'll take that into account as well. Confinement, quite a big one for all of us. Blast depth and charge. Product is also a specific risk. Different products have different risks associated with them. Sleep time, depending on the product. And then, of course, the final one is the blast volume. So how we done this is we actually gave it a score so we can be consistent as well in our approaches. So each of those elements are scored based on a criteria, and then we get a final score. And that final score will say us, yep, there's a potential for fume in this area. Moving on then to the assessment. So we've introduced a site-specific hydrological forecasting model that can predict, with the inputs from the hazard analysis input into the dispersion model, we can actually then forecast if there's going to be fume or blast particulars, where is it going to go to? So the system actually is quite clever. It utilizes some machine learning for adaptability for our site as well. There's some added benefits. It's definitely provides the EPA accreditation, so it ticks a little box on that space as well. And then it gives us the ability to optimize our blast clearance and our position, which is quite important for the operation. And finally, the benefit, once we know where the fume is going to go and what's it going to do, it gives us the ability to put people outside of those zones or increase those zones and then enhance it for safety aspect. Bring it then back to the treatment. So those two inputs then goes into the TARP. So where we have the different risk levels and triggers, like any TARP, level normal, 1, 2, and 3. We're looking at pre-blast conditions. So pre-blast conditions, like factors wind speed, groundwater, sleeping times. We also then, as part of a corrective our actions out of that, we can increase or decrease the blast exclusion zones depending on where the fume is going to go. And then also it identifies safe refuge for the sentries and where they can go to. The other thing it does, it also monitors during and after the blast. So if any of those conditions changes, we can adjust it accordingly. And then also the post-blast management component. So reassess the fume, the drift, where's it going to go to. Finally, the monitoring component. Now, monitoring in this sense is a bit different from what we used to think about it. Because it's a system approach and where everything is documented, we want to make sure that we close that loop and make sure we have got everything ticked. So as part of the blast controller checklist, we've updated that to take all those things into consideration, making sure that the whole process, so it's a verification of that the process was followed. So looking at the weather monitoring, the environmental blast hazard analysis, the blast fume top, exclusion zones, and then also finally the fume risk. The other benefit of this process is that it's repeatable. So it doesn't matter who's the blast controller, people change throughout their swing. The intent of this is that it can be repeated and I have the same outcome every time. So for us, since we had this process implemented, we did over 300 blasts. 41 of them were identified through the environmental hazard analysis of potential fume generating blast. 2 were actually fume generated. And the little video and the animation on the left, on your left there, is actually, the animation was done 24 hours before the blast. And the blast the following day. So you can actually see the correlation between the blast dispersion model and the actual blast. You can see the wind direction of where we're going to go. So based on that information, we've placed our sentries quite clear, out of harm's way, and also we got the ability now to inform potential neighbours and sensitive receivers of potential fume as well in the area. So looking at that, so the importance of this risk-based approach is, the proactive decision-making for us. This approach allows for proactive decision-making strategies in advance, knowing what the risk is. Targeted mitigation, so based on the top, we can have a specific and repeatable mitigating factors that we can put in place. And then finally, and then it's the improved safety protocols. Overall, embedding this risk-based approach in our procedures and as a process, we can definitely monitor a lot better, and we can foresee, put controls in place for unforeseen conditions as well. And then looking forward for us at Wilpinjong, implementing the lessons learned from this incident emphasizes the importance of a risk-based approach, and it also reduces the likelihood of these type of incidents happening in the future again. Thank you.